Can you please tell me your name and your birth date and how old you are today?
Today is my birthday, and my name is Sylvia Kale, and I am 81 years old. I was born in 1924. It seems like a long time ago, but to me it doesn't seem that long.
And what's
And
the date of your birth date?
August the 31st.
And where were you born?
I was born in Chicago at the Mount Sinai Hospital. My mother and father lived in Rock Island, but they moved to Chicago at the time of my birth. And mother came to America when she was 19 to her sweetheart, who she loved. When she arrived at Ellis Island, the sweetheart told her he didn't love her anymore. Now, my poor mother had no money, didn't know the language, and when you leave Poland at that time, you leave. So mother was heartbroken. And somehow, through the Hayas, she got to Columbus, Ohio. And in Columbus, Ohio, they told her about a young man who lived in Rock Island. He came from her hometown, Grodno, and he was an orphan, and he had adopted parents, and he was going with another girl, but they felt that she should write to him. And she did. She wrote him and told him who she was and that she had regards on his family. Would he like to write her back? And he was encouraged to write her back. My mother wrote him again. He wrote her again. And by the third letter, she told him, if you are interested in matrimony, then send me a ticket and I'll come to Rock Island. So my dad, whose name was George Yellen, was sort of reluctant to do that. But his adopted parents, whose name I love dearly, and I want you to remember it, was Hatzkalichi and Hatzkel. They had no children, so they took my dad. And they encouraged my dad to send my mother a ticket. My mother arrived in Rock Island, and he immediately fell in love with her, and it was a wonderful love affair for him. But my mother, on the other hand, still thought about her first love. My sister was born a year after their marriage, and my mother had a brother who she sent for, and they came to Rock Island, and my mother had a dispute with her sister-in-law, so my father said, we're moving to Chicago. And in Chicago came me. And I was born at the Mount Sinai Hospital in 1924, August the 31st. So today is my birthday. And I do remember very little, except we lived on the second floor of a wonderful family called the Kaplans. Now, he was a hat maker, and he had 5 daughters. And they had a round table. And I loved the 5 daughters. There was, if I remember their names, there was Lena and Jenny and Sarah, and I'm afraid I don't remember the other 2, but I loved them, and they would take me around and let me sit at their table while they ate, and they called me the toothpick. So I must have been very thin, but happy. And my mother would wheel me in my buggy with another neighbor, and their little boy was called Jerry, Jerwinka. And so when I see Jerry, very rarely, I do remember him, and I do remember sharing my buggy with him. Then my next memory will take me to my 13th birthday.
Oh, wait, hang on. I want to go back a little bit before that first. You had mentioned that your mother came to America to be with her love.
Right.
She had met him in Poland?
Yes, that was her boyfriend in Poland.
And then he left first?
He left 2 years before she did.
And then she came here?
And then my mother saved her money and came to America to be with him because she loved him.
And then when did your father come here?
My father came when he was 16 years old.
Where was he born?
And he was born in the same town, Grodno Gubernia, and his mother had died. So when his father remarried, he didn't like his stepmother. So at 16, he boarded a ship and came into Galveston, Texas, and joined the Army, which was the First World War. And he loved the Army, he loved the United States, and he became the bugler. And he was a tall, handsome, wonderful, darling man. Of course, everyone thinks their father is darling, but my father was actually charming and a very strong, wonderful person who adored my mother. And my dad had a few little faults. He liked to smoke, and he liked to drink at night. And that was the cause of his demise. So when he was 49, after Passover, which he ate a lot of eggs and a lot of smoking, he died. He had a heart attack, and then he died. And my husband and I had to sell his route. He was in the grocery business and was selling candy and gum to all those small grocery chains, and the two of us had to take his route and prepare it, and we finally, my husband was smart enough to be able to sell it. But my mother was heartbroken and quite alone, so we moved in with her to help her out. Then, as I recall, I was going to have a baby.
Wait, we're jumping way far ahead. That's okay, but we'll hear those. So your father had this grocery type route, candy and gum. Did your mother work?
My mother never worked. My mother was a darling woman. She was short, 5'1", blonde hair, blue eyes, blue-gray eyes, and a charming smile, and very sweet disposition. And she would lolly-dolly a lot. And my dad would wake up on Sunday morning and run for the Sunday breakfast and buy the paper, prepare the breakfast table, clean her Venetian blinds, while she and my sister would casually get up and sit down to eat. But I always helped my dad. I loved to be with him, although he was really not as interested in me because he wanted a son. So he would take me to the barber with him for a Buster Brown haircut and father and son shoes. And I thought, well, that was a great privilege to be able to go to those places, and my dad took me, and that used to make me happy. And growing up, I grew up in the Humboldt Park area.
Okay, wait, let me just go back. You mentioned your father and your mother.
My dad.
Do you have any siblings?
What, darling?
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have one sister who they had early in their marriage. She's 5 years older than I am.
What's her name?
And her name is Sarah Lee. And she's married and lives in Detroit to a man called Barney Kaplan.
Okay, so there were two of you.
There was two of us. Now, my sister never had children. And my sister is now 84, I think. 84 or 85. And maybe this November, she'll be 85.
And where was the first place, when you were born, where was the place you were living? Was it a house, an apartment?
We always lived in an apartment. Jewish people at that point in our life never lived in a home. We always had apartments.
And do you remember the address of that first apartment?
Well, I can't say that I do, but later in life we lived at, I think it was 1302 North Kedzie.
Do you know the street of that first apartment?
1302 North Kedzie.
No, the very first apartment you lived in.
Well, I think it was Division. I was very young.
And do you remember the first school you went to?
First school I went to was Wicker Park. And it was a very old school. It's now remodeled, and they gave it another name. But growing up in Wicker Park, I met my first girlfriend in kindergarten. In kindergarten, the teacher asked us to line up according to height. And I was lucky enough to be tall, and my girlfriend was tall. And she looked at me, and I looked at her, and she said, "My name is Miriam. What's yours?" And she took my hand and said, let's be girlfriends. Well, we are girlfriends to this day. My dearest girlfriend. So I do love her.
What's her last name?
Her name was Lebedeau. Miriam Lebedeau. And then she married to a Chaplik, and they had 4 beautiful daughters. And her husband had an unfortunate accident and was killed in his plane with their 16-year-old daughter, Ivy. And my girlfriend survived that somehow, and she's remarried David Prober. But she had many boyfriends. She was very beautiful and charming, and she is today.
So you've known each other over 70 years?
Over 70 years. And she knows everything about me, and I know a lot about her. But we all lived through her tragedy. And in the course of growing up, you acquire friends. And so we acquired 7 more friends. I have my one girlfriend, Eleanor Levy, married to a writer. But at the time, in the Second World War, when she married him, he was a communist, and that didn't go over very favorably in America. Nothing pinky was so good. So he couldn't get a job, and she had to work very hard, and finally she divorced him and moved to Paris, where she lives today with Jacques Mathieu. And she's 81 now too. And then I have another girlfriend who was gone, Bea Orr, who was my dearest girlfriend, was a young girl, and Fritzi Prinz, who was my girlfriend, and Elaine Risen, and Eileen Singer. They were my girlfriends. Alma Sims was my girlfriend, and Mary Arcus was my girlfriend. But those were girlfriends that I had in school. In my neighborhood, that I lived in Cassie Avenue, in my apartment, the owner of the building was Ogren, and they had a daughter who was a little older than I was. Her name was Gloria. And Gloria and I were girlfriends, and she was a wonderful friend for the simple reason that she was bright and had a lot of fun together. And we would sing together and play the piano together and make up little songs to go around to the neighbors and pester them a little bit. And we were doing Yellen and Ogren, expert G-men. And everybody would close the door on us. Then I had another girlfriend, Patty Riggio. She was Italian, and we would go to her grandmother's house, which had a great big round table, and her grandmother would let me come for spaghetti. And Gloria's mother would have me over for tea and strawberries. And my mother would have them over for chicken soup. And then I had another girlfriend, Ingrid Jensen, who was Swedish, and we would go to her mother to make marzipan. So I had a very, interesting chance to meet different cultures, and I observed the way they lived and enjoyed it.
Going back to your parents, did they have any interests or hobbies?
My mother and father were wonderfully philanthropic. They would support their hometown and send back money, and they belonged to an organization called the Grudner Verein. Now, Grudner Verein means, Grudner was their hometown, and Verein means the club. And they had all the people who came from Grudno would be in this club. And they had a ladies' auxiliary. And they would send money, and they had picnics, and they had dances, and they would raise money. And I was privileged when I was 15 or 16, I remember, to be in the ladies' auxiliary and be their secretary. And I loved everyone, and I went to everyone's funeral because they died young. Everybody had heart attacks or strokes or something, It was a time when you didn't live as long as you do today. I mean, 81 was unheard of. So, to continue.
Do you remember what that first apartment looked like? How many bedrooms?
I do. I even drew it. Before I left, I loved it so much. I had another girlfriend in that building, Jeannie Goldridge, who helped me draw. And she taught me how to make a drawing. And so before I left the apartment, I drew.
Describe what it looked like.
Well, it had a long It was a long hall, and it had a living room and a radio, big radio, and my dad would listen to the radio every night to, who was that? Hi-Yo Silver.
Lone Ranger?
The Lone Ranger and Tonto. Now that was his greatest pleasure, and I would sit there with him, and we would just love it together. And my mother and I were the best girlfriends. We would make scarves together and wear it on our heads, and we would walk together and arm in arm. She was only 5'1", and I'm 5'7", but I loved her. But my mother never loved Chicago or America. Because she resented the time she came, she was so heartbroken. And so she would talk to me in Yiddish. She wouldn't speak English very well, and I learned to speak Yiddish consequently, which was wonderful for me, and I learned to write. So I love that, and I was proud of that. My mother could now read my writing, and we were the best of friends, and she would tell me all of her secret longings, and I enjoyed my mother very much.
So you were describing the apartment. You said there was a long hallway. How many bedrooms?
Well, we had 2 bedrooms. It was not a long hallway, but more of a long apartment, like a railroad apartment. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a sun parlor, a living room with a bookcase, and the dining room had a buffet for your dishes, and the kitchen was very dismal and sort of more into the alley side of the building, sort of a dark kitchen with a refrigerator. As I remember it now, it had a birdcage top, and very small, and very old stove, the kind of you don't see anymore, and an old-fashioned sink. And the beggar would come to the back door to ask for bread or some food. My mother never refused them. And she would have a coin box that she would put in money, so when they would come to collect it, they would have money that she had saved for them. Now, my parents were not rich, but very generous. Not so much for material things, but for goodness. They would take people out of the park. It was a Humboldt Park area. And Humboldt Park was a very magical place. It was a beautiful place to live and grow up at the time. I could ice skate in the winter, play tennis all summer. And when I had children, I walked the park with my friends. I loved it there. I really loved living there. And and now, with my magical park and all my magical friends that really let me grow and encourage me to see new things in life and to open myself to everything, I find that at this point in my life that I'm really very happy. And 81 is not so terrible. It might be frightening if you're 16 or 17, but being 81 is just wonderful because I see everything clearer. I understand things, I understand people better. I understand a lot of things that I didn't quite get. And I have a lot more patience for people and a lot more compassion. And maybe because I got sick and had a stroke when I was 77 or 76, I don't recall. But I'm doing better, and I love my life. I have a wonderful husband, married 63 years, soon 64. And we've had a wonderful life, although when we married, I think that's an interesting story for the children to know.
Okay, well, we're going to get to that, but
okay.
I want to try to keep in order. We will definitely get to that. You told me about your friends as a young child. Do you remember any teachers that you had in school?
I do. I do remember one teacher, Mrs. Galvin and Mrs. Yardley. They were my grade school teachers. They were both wonderful. And then in high school, I had Mr. Bryce and Mr. Paris and Mrs. Konkowski, and I loved high school.
All right, we'll get to that in a second. Did you have any favorite subjects in grade school?
I loved to write. I loved writing. And I wasn't a great student, but I was happy. And I think that's more important.
What kind of a religious upbringing did you have?
I had a wonderful religious upbringing. My mother and father, my mother more than my father, was very kosher. And through my mother, I remained that way. I keep kosher, and I don't eat anything that's been restricted in the Jewish religion. I never tasted anything like that. And I'm quite content. Basically, I'm a vegetarian.
So would your parents celebrate the holidays?
My parents, of course, celebrated the holidays, and I would come to the services with them.
What temple did you belong to?
We belonged to Tered Zion. It was a beautiful temple. I think now it's not a temple anymore for the Jewish people.
Where was that?
It was on Crystal Street.
And did your mother cook for the holidays?
My mother was a wonderful cook, and she prepared everything. And my mother was so wonderful that she would take people off of the street from the Holocaust and give them a fresh bowl of soup that she had just made, or whatever, the chali, or whatever she was preparing. They were served first. And I learned a lot at my mother's table. When I would come home from grade school for lunch, she would always have somebody there that she had brought in that didn't have any food or was quite alone. And they would teach me what happened. They would tell me what happened in their life. Her husband had been on the Titanic. That's how I learned about the Titanic. And he was a salesman. And when the Titanic sank, he was killed. And her name was Mrs. Vilner. And Mrs. Vilner had a son who was in jail. So her life, and she lived in a room by someone, so she was quite lonely and quite alone. But my mother had great compassion for these people. And maybe that's where I learned to enjoy people so much and understand them. Mm-hmm.
So your mother had people over on a regular basis, not even just the holidays. She would have people over all the time.
Yeah.
Your mother would have people over all the time, not just the holidays.
we had wonderful parties at her house, and my dad played the clarinet, and they had an orchestra. And then I had a babysitter from Europe. Came a Mr. Stolarski, who left his wife and 3 children in Europe, and he rented a room from my mother. He became my babysitter, and I loved him, and I would call him Alter. And Alter, as a young child, I do remember this, he would use our bathtub to make rock and rye, and he would put the bottles with the oranges and the fruit on the window, and I thought they were so beautiful until the police came.
Now explain what rock and rye is to people.
Rock and rye is a whiskey drink, I think.
So was this at a time when liquor was illegal?
Well, it wasn't illegal, but it was, it wasn't being banded around, only with the mafia. When the police came to my mother's house, they asked if they had heard that someone was making illegal whiskey in her house. She said there was no such a thing. So Alter had to give up his liquor license there. And in my mother's bathtub, released the bathtub, and went into making marshmallows. And then he finally accumulated enough money to send for his wife and his 3 children. Now, this remains in my head forever. They had 3 children, 2 daughters with bright red hair, and a son who was the youngest. And the 2 daughters that night and I slept together on a mattress in the living room, and I was between them. No matter which way I turned my head, the smell of ocean was in their hair. And I thought, I'll never forget this smell. And Luba has died, and Minna is sick. And Mrs. Stolarski, who taught me how to light the candles and how to pray, and how to wash a floor. She lived in a home, and I used to visit with her. And she was my mother's friend, but also mine.
So after this liquor, he started making marshmallows.
Yes.
In the apartment?
No, in a factory.
Oh, in a factory.
He opened up a little factory, and he made marshmallows. Now his son Harry, I loved Harry. He was a little older than I was, but very wild. And one day on a picnic, he jumped out of a tree and cut my cheek. Well, no one thought too much of it, so I didn't either. And later on, Harry went into the cab business, and he organized the cabs. And then he married some girl, very beautiful girl. They had one child, and he left his money to the child, but the wife took the money and landed in jail. And Harry died.
Was there any anti-Semitism that you felt growing up?
I never experienced that. I never experienced it.
Was the neighborhood completely Jewish? Or
no, it was not completely Jewish. It must have been maybe 90% Jewish, because Rabbi Kahn lived across the street, and another girlfriend I had, Ruth Osinski, and her sister, her cousin Gladys, lived across the street. And for the holiday, they would make a sukkah, and we would be invited into the sukkah in their backyard. And his children went to Palestine at the time to continue the rabbinate studies. Then I had another girlfriend, Corrine Browner, who was home, who had no mother, and played with her a lot. I had another little girlfriend, Rosie Abelson. I mean, I had all these little friends. And then I had a boyfriend, he was a friend, Sherman Levin. Sherman Levin was without a father. And when the war came, the Second World War, Sherman and his brother Harold enlisted in the Navy, and they were in Pearl Harbor. So Sherman was killed in Pearl Harbor, and he was a wonderful child. And his brother was very handsome. And those are my friends that I've experienced through my life.
Okay, getting back to your house and the holidays, what would your mother cook for the holidays? You said she was a great cook.
Oh, she was a great cook, but I was not a great eater. Well, I'm sure there was always soup and the fish that I didn't like.
Did she make the gefilte fish?
Yes, she made her own gefilte fish, and she made her own holly, and she would have meat, which I didn't like. And I don't think she was too big on vegetables. They were big on potatoes.
And would you have other family members over for the holidays?
Yes, we did. My mother had one cousin whose mother was my mother's sister. No, my mother had a mother that she left in Poland, and she had a sister that lived in close to Grodno, and this sister had beautiful children, and so her sister had 3 children, and one child was called Edith, and that's the one I met. So Edith came to America, but Edith was beautiful, and she had a sister who had a boyfriend, Joe. One day Joe came to their home. I'm told the story. Joe came to their home, and he fell in love with Edith, and here he was engaged to her sister. Well, what to do? Well, they had a plan. They decided Edith would come to America, marry one man who came over there to bring her in, and he would get on a boat and come in illegally, which happened. And Edith came to my mother, and from the moment she walked into the house, I loved her. I loved her. She was charming, she was smart, and beautiful. And they would come for dinner, Edith and Joe, and they had a daughter, Selma, who we loved very much.
Do you know how long you lived in that first apartment where you were born?
I must have lived there until I was maybe 9 or 10.
Okay.
And then we moved across the park to Kedzie Avenue.
And was that a 2-bedroom also?
That's the bedroom that's the house I described to you.
Okay, okay.
The other one I don't recall so much.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember, I mean, you were a very young girl when the Depression hit. Do you remember anything about that, what it was like?
I never knew there was a depression. Not that we were rich, but we didn't demand very much. I didn't know that we had a car, and my dad would take us on picnics.
Do you know what kind of car you had?
Well, I'm sure we had a Ford. And he would take us to Michigan. Every summer I would go to a holiday.
Where in Michigan?
Lake Michigan Beach. My cousin Edie had a cottage. We had a cottage right next door. We rented that cottage from my cousin Edie. And I loved Lake Michigan Beach. It was a wonderful place of vacation in the summer.
What would you do there?
What did I do there? Well, we would all go to the ocean, to the lake. And in the lake, there would be a lot of people from the farm. There was a farm up in Michigan that would take them in by bus. So there was a lot of young people. And at that time, I had a lot of young people my age. So we had lots of fun. And we had outhouse bath toilets. And the first one back got a shower from the outside shower that would heat up from the sun. And there wasn't gravel, it was sand roads. And the farmers would come by and deliver all the vegetables and the fruit. And peaches were so good. And then they had berry bushes out there, and apple trees and pear trees. It was like paradise. Paradise couldn't have been any nicer. So I had a wonderful childhood.
And then did you go to a middle school or right to high school?
I went right to high school, but I think, maybe you're correct. Maybe I went to Sabin, which was a middle school, first 2-year school. And Sabin was, I don't think I was too bright to remember anything there. It was just I was going to school. And then when I finally, in the 3rd year, when we went to Thule, and my girlfriend Miriam and Eleanor came to school, and the first day was lipstick. Well, we thought it was the end of the world. So you can see how far we've progressed. So that was my memory.
What do you remember about high school? Anything?
High school, I remember Mrs. Konkowski. And she was I remember I came one day to school, it was my 4th year high school, and she was my English teacher, and I said, Mrs. Konkowski, I think I'm in love, l'amour toujours. And she said to me, oh, Miss Yellen, that was my maiden name. You're too much. And that's when I met my husband to be, not knowing.
In high school?
In high school.
And how did you meet
I'll
him?
tell you how I met him. I think this is a wonderful story. I'm sure the children have heard it, but maybe not the grandchildren. In high school, my girlfriends, I mentioned them all, we decided we were going to have a tea and invite a few other girls to join us. So my girlfriend Elaine's mother was going to prepare the luncheon for us. And I said to my mother, I really have to have something to wear. I'm tired of wearing the same skirt and sweater. Do you think I could have a black dress? I know just what it should look like. And Mrs. Groner, who was the neighborhood dressmaker, will make it for me. My mother, being my best friend, said we'll go right after school. So after school, the two of us put on our little facheles and we walked arm in arm to the Elm. Now in Chicago at that period on Jackson Boulevard, they had lots of fabric stores because it was a manufacturing area. So my mother, she's the one who picked the store, and we went in and the salesman came over to us and my mother said, we'd like to see this black fabric, and he showed it to her and she agreed. And then because he gave us a half a yard more than she asked for, She thought he was wonderful. So when he asked for my address and my phone number, she understood. And she said to him, here's her number, and here's our address. And of course, that night, he ran home to Sal's house. And Sal was eating dinner. And he said, stop eating, I found the girl of my dreams. Here's her number, call her up and we'll make a date. So Sal called. And at that time, you only had one telephone that you put a nickel in. So Sal called, and my mother answered, and he told her who he was, and could he take us out? Yeah. So my mother said, yes, you can come over on Friday night. She'll have a few girlfriends over, and you will bring a few friends, and we'll chaperone, and you can dance in the living room. So it happened Friday night that this boy that I met in the fabric store, his name was Norman, brought Sal and Lou and Maury Kaiserman, and my mother said, you'll invite your girlfriends, but don't invite Miriam, so then she won't be the prettiest, maybe you won't have a chance. Miriam was beautiful. So that's what I did. I invited who she told me, and they came upstairs, and Sal was tall and thin, and after dancing, they said, how about going bowling? And we asked my mother if we could go, and she says, yes, and you're home by 10:30. So we went bowling.
Now, how old were you at the time?
I was 16.
Okay.
So Sal bought me a candy bar. Well, for a candy bar, that was wonderful. I came home that night. My mother said, I said to my mother, which boy did you like? She says, I think I like the tall, thin one. And of course, that was Sal. So then he called the next day to thank my mother, Sal, and could I have another date on Saturday night? And my mother said, sure. So he came over Saturday night with a gardenia for me and a present for my mother. My mother thought he was the cat's meow. And every Saturday we start to date. I was so happy because nobody wanted me. No one ever asked me out. So there I was, dating him. Oh, I did have another boyfriend. His name was, God, I can't remember his name. I don't remember his name.
Was this
but
before?
He was not before, during.
Okay.
Suddenly I had another friend. Not a boyfriend, but a friend. And
so he asked you out for that Saturday night.
so every Saturday night he would come over with the gardenia and a present for my mother, and sometimes a present for me. You know, I had no clothes, so he would bring me a sweater, a blouse, you know, and I thought that was so wonderful because I didn't have anything. And
now, how old was he at the time?
well, he was 20.
And did he have a car?
He had a car.
What kind of car?
He was the only one that had a car, Plymouth.
And what was he doing for a job that he could afford a car?
I don't know if he was doing anything. I think his father had bought him a car. And he was the only one who had a car. So I would pile in all my girlfriends and we'd all go for barbecue, you know. And my one girlfriend, Miriam, and they all liked Miriam again. Now Miriam was in the picture, and she said to Sal, one day Sal had a flat tire and Miriam came out to help him, and she said, I don't know why you like Sylvia so much. You know, she's bow-legged. That was my girlfriend. So Sal said, well, I didn't see it. And
now, where would you go on these dates?
well, we would go to Russell's on North Avenue for barbecue beef. We would go bowling again. Nothing great, but I mean, for me, it was great. And then one day my dad came out, and I was still in the car, and he saw Sal kiss me. I think you better come home. So I went home, and I think a few days later, Sal was called into the Army. And my dad took him put on his uniform and took him to the bus where he had to meet everyone and leave for the Army. And then he had to go to basic training. And so in basic training, he was there for 3 months in Grenada, Mississippi. And after he got through with the basic training, he called me and asked me to come to him. Well, of course I couldn't come alone, and I called his mother. His mother didn't feel up to it. So my mother, who was my best friend, said, "Baby, I'm gonna go with you. Don't feel bad, I'll go with you." And then his mother changed his mind and she came too. But at that time, you didn't go in a plane, you went in a train overnight. And I didn't realize, because I was so young, how hard it was for them to sit up all night. But for me, it was just a joke. And so when we got there in Grenada, Mississippi, Sal, who was so excited that we were coming, did a little jig during his morning parade, and they punished him. So he had to stay in camp that morning, and he was smart enough to send someone to get us, because he had rented a motel room. And in the motel room was a window, and I stood near the window to watch it when he's coming. And there I saw somebody running down the street, jumping up and down. He used to jump when he walked. So I said, well, there he is. I'll run out to meet him. My mother took my window seat and watched as I ran to him and he ran to me, and we both embraced. When I got back into the room with Sal, he kissed his mother, and my mother said, "You know what, Katie? I think they love each other," because she saw us kiss, and I think she had memories of her love. And she didn't want that to happen to me. So my mother-in-law said to me, "Oh, kiss, what's a kiss?" My mother said, "I think they're in love, and I think they should get married." And my mother-in-law said, "When?" And my mother said, "Now." And in 1 week, we were married. My father came down in his
Wait, did he ask you to marry him, or your mother just
My mother prepared the whole
Your mother just said it.
My dad came down in his military uniform, and he found a rabbi in Jackson, Mississippi, and all the accoutrements like wine and herring, talked to the commandant of the camp, and invited anybody who wanted to come for fresh food. I had 200 people, I didn't know one. I had an $11 wedding dress, a 17-cent wedding ring, but I had a $6 orchid.
Oh my God.
And there we were, married. We were both shaking. We didn't realize what it meant.
Now, how old were you?
Now I'm 17, and he's 21. And when he asked me, "Do you want to marry me?" I thought to myself, well, gee, I have nothing better to do. It's the best offer I've had all my life. Maybe I better marry him. The smartest thing I ever did is marry him, because in the 63 years that we've lived together, he's been the most wonderful, kindest, dearest man that I could ever want. He's ethical, he has integrity, and when you meet Sal, you meet a real person. And going through all the people that I met, I know a real person.
So you were married?
We were married.
And did you go on a honeymoon or anything?
What, honey?
Did you go on a honeymoon or anything?
A honeymoon? I don't think so. We didn't have anything. We had no money. I had 11 cents, maybe 21 cents in my purse. And my mother gave me $50, and his mother gave us $50. And that's what we had. And we had nothing. And he went to war. He went to England a year later.
So now what happened right after you got married?
After we got married, we lived in Mississippi. And I remember meeting a girl there whose name was Esther Kessler, and she and her husband were very nice to us. Her husband was a chef in the camp, and her stepmother would send her food. And when I would write home to my mother, my sister would write back for my mother and say, "It's too bad that you don't have anything to eat. Too bad." So consequently, I kept my girlish figure, and I was happy regardless. And my husband would come home, you know, maybe once or twice a week. I had you know, they had a program for the girls who were in the army camps. What do they call those programs? Do you remember?
No.
It was a program that you would go to once a week, and then all the army wives would introduce each other, and they would serve us. So one day, when I came there, I said, "You know, I'm hungry, so it's okay if you serve a little more." And they thought that was funny. And Mississippi is a real southern town. Really southern. You had to sit in the back and the front. You didn't sit in the back. So they called me the damn Yankee. They didn't like me because I sat in the back with them. And I would tell them, "Why don't you come north? You're going to make much more money than $3 a week." And maybe I was the instigator. So anyway, we traveled in the camp. He would call me and tell me he has to go to Cooksville, Tennessee. And there I was. I had to follow him to Cooksville. And then he went to Reading, and then he went to Pennsylvania, where he had to go overseas. No, Louisiana. And then from there he went to Pennsylvania, where he went overseas. And then he was gone for 3 years. And he was in the invasion. But he came home, was wonderful. And
so did you write letters back and forth?
we wrote every day. I wrote him every day.
And where were you living?
I worked. Then I graduated from school.
And now where were you living when he went away?
I was living on Kedzie Avenue with my mother and father.
So you moved back to Chicago when he went away?
Oh, sure. I moved back to the city.
And you graduated from high school?
Graduated from high school, and I got a job as in a wholesale suit manufacturing company in Rebec, where I became their sample model. Finally, and then one day, I was looking at my shoes, and I thought to myself, they're so run down. I hope I never have to wear shoes like this again. But those are the little things you remember, you know, that hit home. It's like my 13th birthday. I used to beg my mother and father to remember it and to buy me a little Orphan Annie watch. That's all I really wanted. Just get me a little Orphan Annie watch. And sure enough, on my birthday, they gave me an envelope, and I opened up the envelope, and there was a picture of a little Orphan Annie watch. Now that, I remember that very clearly, my big disappointment. But that was a good lesson. And, you know, when you're young, not too many things stick in your mind. But something that was important to me at the time did. And what else can we talk about?
So then, when did your husband come back?
Now my husband came back. How happy we were. And,
what year was this now?
What, honey?
What year was this?
It was in 1940, when the war ended. When we bombed Hiroshima, the war ended.
Now, do you remember the day the war ended?
I think I should remember that.
I don't remember. I don't mean, do you know the date? Do you remember in your mind what happened that day when you heard that the war ended?
No, I don't. I think we were all very happy and grateful. And my husband came home in October of that month. No, he came home in the summer of that month, of that year. And
So you hadn't seen him for 3 years?
I hadn't seen him for 3 years.
So what was that like?
Oh, it was the most wonderful. You can't believe. I really didn't know him. I really didn't know him. And we didn't have very much time together. So it was just a reawakening of someone that you knew was nice. And my mother picked him out for me. And my mother at that time was in Michigan. So we went, my dad drove us to Michigan to my mother, and his mother came with us. And he and his mother took him for a walk. She wanted to be alone with her son. And when he told her that I had saved $2,500, she was amazed and not very happy about it.
Why not very happy?
Well, because I never told her I'd saved that money. I didn't confide in her that way. I never thought about it. You know, when you're young, not everything is so important. So we had $2,500 that I had saved, and my father and mother said to us, let's buy a cottage here in Lake Michigan Beach together. And so we did. My dad bought half and we bought half, and my mother-in-law and father-in-law had a fit. They said, you have no place to live and you buy a cottage? Well, we were young. And then we had no place to live. So Sal had an Aunt Fanny and an Uncle Alvin, and she said she'd rent me a room. And she'd give me coffee and toast for breakfast. Okay.
Now, where was this?
That was on the west side of Chicago.
Do you remember the address?
Oh, no, I don't remember. I just remember Aunt Fanny was very sweet.
And how much did she charge you for that room?
Well, I'm sure it couldn't have been a fortune. Maybe $10 a week. You know, it wasn't, money at that time wasn't so outrageous as it is today. And they needed the money. So we moved in with Aunt Fanny. I remember being on the bus one day going back to my mother, and it was a rainy October day. And I thought to myself, oh, how wonderful it would be if I had a home of my own. Just something of my own. And my mother had a friend, the Stolarskis, Minna, who offered me her apartment for $500. So we gave them the $500. $500 to move into her apartment.
But then you paid monthly rent. That was just
of course, just to buy
her apartment.
Just to buy her lease. And we were lucky enough to get that apartment. It was on the 3rd floor. It had 1 bedroom, a living room, and Sal had a cousin, Manny Marmer, who was a furrier. And he was redecorating his salon. So he sold us his old furniture for a nominal amount of money, and we moved in. And the first night I had the little table set, and I put candles on the table, and I don't know what I was serving, something that was very simple, I'm sure. And as we sat down to eat, the L train stopped in front of our window. And they looked at us, and we looked at them. We thought, this is the funniest thing we've ever seen. So I blew out the candles, and we decided to eat in front of the radio. And then I had a baby. I had a baby because my mother-in-law kept insisting you have to have a baby. So okay, and we had the baby.
Now, who was the baby?
The baby's name was Scott. He was a little boy. And from the moment I had him, he was a joy. He was the dearest baby in the world. And this baby grew up to be a doctor, a lawyer, and he's very well known in Chicago, and his office hours are booked. You can't get in anymore. And he's just a wonderful child who calls me twice a day, 3 times a day, as busy as he is. And through this boy, we had an adventure of our life. He married a girl that he met when we had an apartment in Florida. this girl turned out to be an adventure in herself. And she was a crook. She was a confidence woman, took him for everything he had. Was really after my husband for his money. And I've written a book about it, and I hope to have it published soon. Then we had a little girl.
Wait, now how long were they married?
They were married. They lived together for about 3 years, and they might have been married 8 or 9. I don't recall the exact time that they were married. But she was really a charming woman. But she was mixed up, very mixed up. She left 3 boys, divorced her husband, and moved in with Scott. And then she went to town spending money. And then, fortunately, we got rid of her, and now he has a very nice wife, Joan. They have no children, but they have a lot of pets and a beautiful home. And they live in Highland Park. My daughter went to school in Oklahoma.
Wait, now tell me, when was she born?
Now, she was born, I think, 4 years after Scott. And
what was her name?
Her name was Gail. But after the day that she was born, she was born at a Catholic hospital, and the nun came in and wanted me to give her the name of the baby girl. So I was going to call her Georgine after my dad, but I was on the phone with my girlfriend Marion Pollock, who said that's too much for a baby to spell Georgine. Call her Gail. So I listened to my girlfriend and I named her Gail. But Gail grew up to be a very wonderful girl. Went to school in Oklahoma, after grade school and everything. In Oklahoma, she met this Oklahoma boy, Russell Patterson, and they fell in love. And they wanted to get married. But Russell was not Jewish. So I said to Rusty, you know, if you want my Gail, you'll have to convert. And you have to promise me you'll never leave Chicago. And so he did. He converted, and they lived a few blocks away. And they're very happy, and they're married 31 years, and they have 2 children, Tracy and Nikki. And I love the children. They're wonderful children. And they live close by.
So are those your only 2 children?
That's our only 2 grandchildren.
No, I mean your 2 children.
My 2 children and my 2 grandchildren, that's it.
Okay, and then when your second child was born, your daughter, did you still live in the same place?
When my second child was born, we now were living on Kedzie Avenue with my mother. My father had died, and my mother needed someone to stay with her. So we moved back with my mother, and I had the baby there. And then we built a home in Lincolnwood. And we all moved to Lincolnwood, my mother, the children. And my mother, who was a darling woman, said to me one day, you know, Sylvia, I had my life to live, and you have your life to live. So I think I'm going to go to Florida. And if you send me to Florida, I'm going to appreciate it. So we did. We sent Mother off to Florida, where she came back the following season with 3 proposals.
Oh.
My father had died, and she was heartbroken. And I had to walk with her in the back alleys because she couldn't face people. And then, from her organization, they went to New York on a convention. And when she came home from the convention, she said, I could hardly wait to tell you, but guess who I saw at the convention? My first love, Sam. How could I have loved him? He was short, bald, and dumpy. And your father was tall and handsome. I must have been, she says, blinded. And all those years I dreamt about Sam, but I had the most wonderful man in all my life. So when my dad died, she was really heartbroken. But there she was in Florida, and she came home with 3 proposals. And who should she take? Well, the man in New York, she didn't want, because she didn't want to leave me. And the man in Evansville, Indiana, they weren't Jewish enough. And the man in Chicago, she thought that would be the man. And they eloped. They eloped and they lived in Florida. But they had an unhappy ending. They traveled. They went to Greece and Israel. And he had 2 children of his own. George Diamond Steakhouse, and a daughter who was very smart. And she had a daughter, and the daughter died, and the son died. His son and daughter both died. And he was distraught. My mother broke her hip. My sister was getting divorced. It was a very unhappy time for them. So my mother lived with me, and I tried to put her back on her feet. And finally, when she was able to go back to Florida, she did. And I sent her with a woman to help her, but she sent the woman back. And she and Al decided that they didn't want to live anymore, and so they took sleeping pills, and they ended their life. So that was a hard time.
When was this?
That happened in maybe 1954.
Okay, you were telling me about your mother ending her life. How old were you at that time?
Well, my daughter was going to have her 13th birthday. I must have been around 40.
And how did you hear about that?
How did I hear about it? I think one of her neighbors called me. And I think I was distraught. And so I sent my sister down to get my mother back home. Took care of it that way.
So you mentioned your 2 young children that you had, and you were living in that apartment. How long did you live in that apartment for, until they were how old?
Well, my son went to kindergarten and 1st grade. And when I was taking him out of 1st grade, I said to the teacher, you know, we're moving to Lincolnwood. Do you think you'll be okay? So she says, you know what you ask me? Will my son be happy? That's what you should say. He will be okay, but will he be happy? And that will be what you have to work at. And I hope I've worked at it, and I have a happy son.
So how old were you? How old were they when you moved to Lincolnwood? He was just after 1st grade?
Well, I took him out of 1st grade, transferred him to Lincolnwood, and I might have been around, I really don't recall my age, because it wasn't important at that time.
And so you bought a house in Lincolnwood?
We built a home.
What was the address?
We built it on Keystone, 6849 North Keystone, off of Toohey.
And do you remember how much the house was at the time?
The house cost us, with a lot, about $34,000.
And how long did you live there?
We lived there for 20 years.
And do you remember how much you sold it for?
We sold it for $98,000, but we took the $98,000 and bought 990 for $119,000.
990 Lakeshore Drive.
990 Lakeshore Drive for $119,000, and when I sold $119,000, I came here, and the day that I bought this apartment, I sold my apartment. So I paid $198,000 here, I think.
And how much did you sell the 990 for?
I think $120,000. And now my apartment is valued at $2 million.
And how long ago did you buy it?
23 years ago. Maybe 24 years ago. And I've enjoyed living here. I mean, really on top of the world. And it's interesting that a girl that comes from Humboldt Park, humble beginnings, can come to this height over her Chicago, which I love. And I watched Chicago grow to be the most beautiful city, because I don't know if I mentioned to you that we had 2 other homes in the interim of my life. We had a beautiful home in Wisconsin on Lake Benedict in Nippersink. And that home was the most beautiful home. It was 1.5 acres. We built a tennis court for my son, who was a wonderful tennis player. And then we had a gorgeous home in Florida, in Del Rey, in the Del Air Country Club. We lived there for 35 years in the winter. But when I got sick, we had to sell everything. And here I am. But I'm doing better.
All right, let's go back now. When you were raising your kid, when you moved to Lincolnwood, that was really the first time you had ever lived in the suburbs, correct?
That was the first time I lived in the suburbs. And Lincolnwood was a wonderful place to live and grow up.
Now, how was that different from being the city? How did you adjust to that?
Well, it was a community different than my community that I grew up in. And they had better school in Lincolnwood. And I became a Girl Scout leader, a Boy Scout leader. And my son was on the baseball team, so I was the editor for the paper. And I found lovely friends there. My girlfriend Sally and Ernie, Shirley, and her husband, and Pearl and Heikesh, and I had a lot of friends there. And my Miriam, she moved to Lincolnwood too with her husband. They built a gorgeous home.
Now, what was your husband doing at the time?
Now, my husband is a Horatio Alger story, because he really graduated from high school and didn't go any further. So he came home from the Army, and what to do? He has a wife, he had to support me, and his father, who helped us when we were in the Army. He did help us. He sent us $45 a month, because rent was $45 a month. And I got $110 from the Army, but we had to save that for traveling. And his father said to him when he came home, "Come in to work with me." Now, they just had a very small business. And Sal came home, and his father said, "I'm going to make you a partner, and here's our first week's salary. You get 85 and I get 85. And Sal came home. We were living on Concord on the 3rd floor. And he said to me, "Here's our first week's salary, $85. And I said, "My God, we're rich." And he says, "No, we're not rich. But it's a start, and I'm going to make it up to you and to my father." And from that point, he worked 7 days a week. And at night, we would do our deliveries. And he worked very hard to become the largest uniform dealer in America, because he had his own catalog, and he cataloged all over the United States. And he had a big business. That by the time we grew up, he had 6 stores. And it wasn't the stores, but we saved our money. We lived very frugally. And he bought real estate, and that's where we have our income. Now, he had 2 people who worked for him, who he was very good to and very trusting. They turned out to be not so good people and not so trusting. And so he decided one day to sell the business, and we sold it to Warren Buffett. Why did Warren Buffett buy our business? Because Warren Buffett bought a manufacturer, Feckheimer Brothers in Cincinnati, who manufactured uniforms for the North and the South. And so they're longtime manufacturers, very established business. And then he bought all the retail stores, so he could manufacture for the retail and get it both ways. And we sold him our name and our business. And Sal was very generous to his employees. And he retired because he had a non-compete for 10 years. At the end of the 10 years, I wake up with a stroke. And he didn't know what to do. So he decided he would take some of his money and he would take 2 people that he liked and put them back in the business and teach it to them and finance it, which he did. Today, we discover it wasn't the best idea. But we're going to try to crawl out of it. And that's our life. And now we really will retire. And maybe we will have a few good years left. I hope we do.
Okay, go back and tell me now, you moved to Lincolnwood with your children. What was that like raising them? Did you go on family trips?
Lincolnwood, Sal, I told you Sal was a hard worker. And he worked 7 days a week, including Sunday. And I would do the mowing of the lawn, and I would do a lot of homework in the house and cooking. And I was a black belt shopper for the cheapest price of everything. And I loved Lincolnwood. It was a wonderful place to live. And my next door neighbors were wonderful. And my neighbor Sally and I would get up in the morning after the kids left for school, jump into the car, and go shopping for the day. Hurry home to make supper for the kids and for the husband, and that was my life. I was in a few productions, like Make My Miami for B'nai B'rith, and another one I was in where I played Jacqueline Kennedy. Well, at that time I had red hair. and now I write. And I don't write for publication, but this one I am going to publish, my last one. And I have a friend, Felicia, who I've become acquainted with, who is helping me. And she read a few of my stories, which she loved, and she mentioned in the Skyline. So you never know. In life, we never know what our future holds.
Now, so what kinds of things would you do with the kids? Did you go on any trips?
My husband worked, so we didn't trip around too much. We were home people.
How did you raise them religiously?
I raised them. I raised 2 beautiful children. 2 ethical, wonderful people, as you could tell by my daughter. And if you'd meet my son, you'd be very impressed. They're lovely people. They're nice people. And I'm proud of them.
So did you belong to a temple when you moved
I always belonged to a temple. And I belonged to the Isles West, Habonim, which is now Habonim. I've gone through 3 rabbis. Rabbi Jacobs, who died, Rabbi Brief, who's retired, emeritus, and now Rabbi Ginsburg, who's the new rabbi.
And then what happened to your children? Did they go off to college?
My children went off to college, got beautifully educated. My daughter is a religious major, and she does a lot of charity work too. And my son is too busy to do anything but work hard. He's like his father, he's a hard worker.
And did you belong to any clubs or groups while
Well,
you were
I do
raising your
belong
kids?
to art. We do belong to art. We belong to Weissman Institute, and we belong to, of course, the Jewish Federation, and PAWS, which is a new foundation for cats and dogs that are homeless. And my husband's very charitable.
And what about when you were raising your kids? Were you a member of any groups or clubs, or did you?
Well, when I was raising the children, we had our own little club from our neighborhood. We'd call it a poker club, and we would be together for a holiday like New Year's Eve. We would have Halloween parties, snowball fights. We had a nice raising of the families, and my children were wonderful. They were never in any trouble, so I never had any aggravation that way, and I had a lot of pride. My son played basketball, baseball, tennis, Haley wasn't so much of an athlete. Oh, Haley, when she married Rusty, took up Spanish, and they went to Mexico to learn more Spanish. So in Mexican language, they don't pronounce the G. It becomes H. The G is an H sound. So instead of calling her Gailey, they called her Haley. And she loved that name, and so she changed it legally.
And after your children went off to college, did you stay in Lincolnwood at that point?
Well, no, I didn't, because the children said to me one day, we're going to school, we're going to college, and you're free. You don't have to live in Lincolnwood. But we did take a trip with my darling sister-in-law and brother-in-law, who both have passed away and were our best friends through our lifetime. We went to Israel with them. And I wrote a book about that, like our journey book. And we had a wonderful time while the children were both at college, and no pets to worry about, no one to call us, no one to aggravate us. So off we went to Europe. And we went to England, and we went to Rome, and we went to Israel. And then during the year after the children were gone in college, we went to Korea. We went to Hong Kong. We went to Romania, Poland, Prague, Paris. So I've done a bit of traveling.
So is that when you first started traveling, after they went off to college?
That's right, I never left them.
And then after college, did they come back home?
No, they got married.
They both got married right out of college?
Well, my daughter got married in her third year of college, but after they were married a little bit, she went back to school and got her degree. And my son went to medical school, and when I had a home in Florida, and during the break of his residency, he came down to Florida, and that's when our story begins with his life.
You want to tell me about that?
I really can't tell you. It's a long story, but I'll tell you a little. I'll try to define it very quickly. We lived in a very beautiful condominium on the Intercoastal Water. And life was very beautiful, and food was very good there, and the air was very good, and we weren't aware of the sunshine yet. We were just having a good time. And I played tennis every day with my husband. And so Scott called me one day and said he had free time. We invited him to come down. Coming down, he came late at night, so I was a little sleepy, and I said, you boys go down, reserve the tennis court, and I'll be down in a little while. In the elevator, a girl stepped in, and my husband knew right away that there was an attraction. And then, as fate would have it, we had a call from Chicago that we had to come home to settle some business. So we said to my son, here is the key to the beautiful apartment. Here's the key to our Rolls Royce. Here's our credit card. Enjoy yourself while you're here. And this, we didn't know about the young lady. So the young lady went after him, and he was not really a very worldly guy, and she was beautiful and very smart. And the next thing we know, in May, he called us up and said he's in love. And who's the girl? The girl in the building. She was divorcing and left her 3 children, 2, 4, and 6. Came to Chicago and lived with him, and then came the big time spending, and then came the marriage, and then really came the big time spending. And then one day she told us, we don't know her real name. And now it was time to tell us. Who are you? I'm Lady Elaine Phillips Chalmers Clifton, the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Northumberland. Now, I didn't know the Duke of Northumberland, and I don't know too many people who do, so we couldn't believe it. But she invited us to see her castle that she inherited and all her land, and we had the adventure of a lifetime Little did we know we were paying for it. And then when we finally came home after seeing all the wonders of Scotland and England, she got a job with PaineWebber, and I think that's when she really went to town, and I think she embezzled them. She took all my son's money. She lied terrifically, terrific liar, but she told me her son was a better liar than she was, and she had 3 beautiful children, and finally it was the end. My son caught on. And then we had to pay to get rid of her. So I told you the whole story. I left out a few little things that I think you have to read.
Okay. And then what was it like having grandchildren versus having children?
Oh, having grandchildren is the biggest thrill any mother could have. And Haley had a hard time having her children, but they came out beautiful. And they're lovely children. The boy is married. He's 25, to a young lady from Ohio that he met at university. And she's going to be a lawyer this May. She graduates. And they have a little dog they adopted from the pets, you know, the homeless dogs. And I love that little dog, Kitty. She's a darling little dog. And they let me have her when I'm alone in the house for company. And Tracy is 27, and she works for an attorney. And they want to send her to school to be a tax, to know the tax rules, or to be a paralegal. I don't know which. Right now she's not feeling too good. And I've enjoyed them, and I've helped them. My husband's been very generous. He bought them each an apartment and now a home for the boy, and each got a car. Not bad. maybe not that so good, but not bad.
And how often do you see them?
I see them at least once a week. The boy calls me 2 or 3 times a day.
And have you ever gone on any trips with them?
Yes, I took them to Italy.
When was that?
I took them before my stroke 5 years ago. So I took my son, his wife, my daughter, her husband, and the 2 grandchildren. And we had a most wonderful time. And I could show you the book. I wrote a story about that. It was a wonderful time.
And when did you have the stroke? Tell me about that.
I had the stroke July, I think it was the 14th, early in the morning. I woke up and I couldn't walk. Fell. And I really had I didn't have a premonition, but I had warnings, but I didn't understand them. Now they tell you on television what to look for. But my leg, I told you I was a black belt chopper. And suddenly I couldn't chop very long, and my legs were hurting me, and I thought, what is wrong? But I never suspected a stroke. I didn't know about it. So there I was, but very close to the hospital. So when I fell, I said to my husband, I've had a stroke. It's 6 o'clock in the morning. Call up the paramedics. They came right away. And they took me to Northwestern. And from there, they put me in the rehab after a few weeks. Oh, hi, girls. Hi, darling. They put me into the rehab. And they tried to help me to walk. And I am walking. Not very well, but I'm walking. And, you know, my arm is moving. I don't look like I have a stroke, do I?
No, not at all.
No. Well, I was lucky. It didn't affect my face and my speech and my brain.
And so what do you guys do now with your time?
Now, my husband, after I had the stroke, his non-compete was over, and he's he said to me, there's a young man, he sold a shopping center, and there's a young man in there.
What shopping center did you tell me?
You know which one? It was the, he'll tell you, but it was on Roosevelt Road. And he had another shopping center across the street. So he took one of these kids that he liked and said to him, I'm going to support you, and I'm going to teach you the uniform business, and I'm going to give you $1 million, but you have to pay me back. Not too many people do that. And then he took another young man, an Indian, that he always employed, and gave him a store and said, I'm going to put you into the mailman business. I'm going to support you and you'll pay me back. And that's what he's done. Well, I think I have a message here. I think I do have a message. And I want to put it right. But my husband is very generous and very giving. Not everybody understands that. People don't do that. And you very rarely hear anybody giving you $1 million, you know, and teach you. It's not appreciated. It's not really appreciated. And he's just learning that now. So he's a little heartbroken because reality sets in. And that's a lesson for everyone to learn. You can't be giving and trusting all the time. It's nice to be nice, but passing out things are not always so nice. They're not always understood and appreciated. And he's learning his lesson.
So, are you still both involved in that business?
Yes. He's trying to crawl out now.
And what do you do on a daily basis?
I have my trainer on Tuesday and Thursday, so I'm home. And I'm alone in bed. And my husband takes me to breakfast and leaves for those 2 stores. And he has a couple of other real estate pieces that he has to watch. So that's what he does. And by the time 3 o'clock comes, I'm tired. I don't have the energy for the rest of the day. So I find myself in bed again. And I love to play the piano, but I don't anymore. I love to read. I can't anymore. I love to write, but I don't anymore. But I do enjoy when I see people, and I do enjoy getting a little fresh air. And that's what, I'm content. I'm content. I'm not unhappy. I'm not unhappy. And I do love my husband. I think he's wonderful, and I'm grateful for him. I'm grateful to my mother for suggesting this proposal. See, she was my best friend.
What do you think was the best time of your life?
I think now is the best time of my life. I think now I see my children are happy and they have their mates and their grandchildren and they're going through their life. And as my mother said to me one day, you have your life to lead, I had my life to lead. That's the only fair way. So I try not to interfere too much and let them learn for themselves.
What was the worst or hardest time of your life?
Well, the hardest time of my life was when my mother took her life and my father died, because that's your security blanket. You know, when you have your mother and father, you're still a child. And they loved me and I loved them.
How old were you when your father died again?
I must have been in my 30s. My dad was very young, very tall, strong, beautiful man. At that time, I don't think they had heart transplants. You know, we progressed a little bit. I think if they had had, at that time, heart transplants, because he was a big smoker, and he liked his drinking, so I think, and a big eater, but all the wrong things. You know, my mother cooked greasy, fried herring, you know, fried everything.
What has changed the most in your lifetime in the world? What changes have you noticed the most?
Well, I grew up with the radio. I grew up with one telephone. Now I have a television in every room. I have a phone in every room. I have a luxurious apartment. I have help that can help me. Didn't have that before. There isn't anything that I'm in need of. I'm very grateful to live here. Very lucky. I'm lucky. I know that I have been blessed. So in life, we always have bad things that happen, but then there are good things, and I don't dwell on the bad things.
But what have you noticed in the outside world that's changed the most?
On my outside world?
Like,
well,
people,
now I live downtown 28 years. When I moved down here, it was the most beautiful area. It was quiet and residential and very elegant. And now it's like a zoo. And I'm happy to get up to the apartment away from the zoo. And I don't go down very often because of that. And I'm quite content to be alone now. I don't need a lot of people. And I think that's a quiet life is what's right for me now.
What about the world, how it's changed?
And my world.
Not your world, but I mean the outside world.
And the outside news, world.
What changes have you noticed there?
Well, of course, everybody blames our president for the war. And people are against Bush very much. But I've lived through a lot of presidents, starting with Hoover, I think. Yeah, I think Hoover. And he was the one who we felt caused the Depression. This president isn't doing so great either. And I feel that after this president is over, I hope we get a better thinking president, one with a little more brains and common sense to help make the world right. Because America is a beautiful country, but it's being torn down, you know. It's just being they're letting in everything and everybody. And, you know, if I could buy it cheaper, I will, which makes the American people out of the league. They cannot manufacture here. So, I mean, there's a problem here.
What do you think is the biggest problem in the world today?
Our biggest problem today, of course, is this war in Iran. But if I were to be a mother and I had to send my child there, I would just be out like this other mother, campaigning to get rid of this war. What are we doing there? What in the world are we doing there? We're not going to change their religion. We're not going to change their thinking. But is anybody going to change ours? You want to make them a democracy. They don't even know what that is. And every country seems to have a problem today. I was just reading on the internet that Paris is getting very anti-Semitic. Very anti-Semitic. Do you know why? They have 6 million Arabs there. Arabs do not like the Jews. What do the Jewish people do to them? I wonder all the time. We have a little piece of land that they're breaking away from. And of course, Netanyahu thinks that we're crazy to do that. So, I mean, there's much to discuss about our world situation. And of course, I don't think I'll be around much longer, so I feel sorry for the new generation. Maybe they'll straighten it out.
Any regrets or anything you would change about your life?
I don't think so. I really don't think so. I've had a wonderful life. I'm happy with my life, and I hope the children will be happy with theirs.
Do you believe in God?
I do believe in God. You know, can I tell you a joke?
Sure.
Okay. In 1925, Mrs. Goldberg went to North Miami and went into a hotel and asked for a room. The clerk told her he's sorry, but they have no room available. Just then, a man came and checked out. So Mrs. Goldberg said, "Oh, look, he checked out. Now you have a room for me." "No," said the clerk, "I'm sorry. This is a restricted hotel, and we don't rent to Jews." Mrs. Goldberg says, "Jews? I'm not Jewish. I'm Catholic." "You're Catholic?" "Yes. Who is Jesus Christ?" "Jesus Christ was the son of Mary." And where was he born?" "He was born in a stable because a jerk like you wouldn't rent him a room." So that's my joke of today.
That's funny. So you do believe in God?
I believe in God, although I think to myself, you know, they're trying to show us something else. And maybe there is something else that I don't know, but as long as I live, I believe in the Eibishter. I'm very Jewish. I love the Jewish religion. It means a lot to me. I find it a wholesome religion, a clean religion, and I think that's nice.
If there is a God and you meet him someday, what do you think he'll say to you?
"Welcome. Welcome, welcome to my home." And I hope I meet my mother and father there.
What do you think they'll say to you?
"You look good, daughter."
Is there a message you want to leave for your children and grandchildren and beyond on how to live a nice life?
I think my children are living a nice life, and they are ethical, and they are wonderful people, and I'm proud of them. And as long as they stay that way and know the value of life, friendship, that we're not here forever, and that we, mother and father, loved them, and they were good to us, and we were good to them, I can't think of anything more than my blessings for them. To be ethical, and to be kind, and not to hold a grudge, and not to think unkind things. I think that's easier on you than being unhappy about something. When you see someone that you don't think is correct, don't take it so big. It's not so terrible.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good, huh?